It's the capacity of the bottleneck that determines the performance of the pipeline. When you think of the richest person in the world, who do you think that is? Or who do you think is the richest person ever? You might think Jeff Bezos, you might think Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, something like that. But actually, none of those are the richest person in American history. The richest individual in American history was John D. Rockefeller. 1937, John D. Rockefeller was the first billionaire ever. He had $1.4 billion, which was 1.5% of the US GDP, gross domestic product. So according to that metric, he was and still is actually the richest individual in American business and economic history. You probably heard of him. What you probably have not heard is that the way that he became wealthy, of course, was through oil, but he leveraged a strategy which is called the theory of constraints. What is the theory of constraints? It's been widely written about. He did not invent the strategy, he just deployed it. In fact, he deployed it in reverse. But what is the theory of constraints? The theory of constraints says that you identify the single most limiting factor of something and systematically improve that one point to boost the throughput of everything else. In a word, it's a bottleneck, right? So you go, if there's a bottleneck, if you can improve the bottleneck, you can improve the performance of the entire system. Well, what Rockefeller did actually was he used it in reverse. So by the year 1890, his company, Standard Oil of Ohio, was already making a lot of money. They were starting to make a lot of money. And what they were doing is they were buying out all their competitors. Most people were happy to have their company bought out. Rockefeller, had very generous offers. He was accumulating a lot of money, and a lot of people would take it. But the people who refused to sell out to him, he basically forced them to by leveraging the theory of constraints in reverse. So instead of releasing bottlenecks, what he did was he created bottlenecks on his competitors. How? Like, what does that mean? I'll give you some examples. So one of the things that he did was, when you transport oil, comes in barrels, right? You have to transport in these barrels. And so what Rockefeller would do is he would buy up all the barrels. And when he bought up all the barrels, the smaller companies couldn't get it, and they couldn't afford to pay as much as he could for the barrels. So he owned the barrels, therefore he blocked their pipeline. The other thing that he would do is he was friends with the people who owned the railroads, rich people hanging out with each other, and he would leverage those relationships to limit the number of shipments of oil that would go, like the number of trains that would go to the places that those other companies needed them to go. So he created a bottleneck. They couldn't get the supply. Another thing that he did, one useful fact I learned in business school, was that he would take equipment, right? So in any type of business, there's certain equipment that people need. And, in those days, it was very much a physical piece of, some either like a part for a train or just a part for the process. What he would do is he would buy up all of the replacement parts. And so he figured out what was the critical equipment that everybody needed to produce oil. It's kind of like the barrel thing. And he would buy up all the replacement parts, even if he didn't need them, because then once their stuff broke, they couldn't produce more oil. And at one point there, he had this one competitor who was a rival. And what they were going to do is they were trying to build a pipeline across Pennsylvania. This is around like 1874. And this competitor is trying to, has this plans in place, and they're building this pipeline across Pennsylvania. So what did he do? He bought the land in Pennsylvania that they had to go through so that he could block it. I mean, he was cutthroat. I mean, he created bottlenecks. He knew that while he couldn't control competitors, he couldn't stop them. He knew that if he could find the point of vulnerability, and squeeze on it, it would create a bottleneck. By creating that bottleneck around the space, the industry, it prevented other people from being able to do what they do. This is known as the theory of constraints. In his case, he was working it in reverse. So how do we summarize that? The way that we describe the theory of constraints is this. The capacity of the bottleneck is what determines the performance of the entire pipeline. It's the capacity of the bottleneck that determines the performance of the pipeline. So visually, it looks kind of like this, all right? So we call this pipeline potential. And this is just an obscure, vague diagram of how you might think of a pipeline of anything. In Rockefeller's case, it was moving oil, but you could have a sales pipeline, a marketing pipeline, a production pipeline. And if you just go overall, the capacity of the pipeline when it's operating at its full efficiency, let's just say, is 80 units. So they, like in lean manufacturing, Six Sigma stuff, they call this throughput potential. So the throughput potential of the pipeline is 80 units. But if the bottleneck capacity is only 50 units, then that affects the entire pipeline. So even though the throughput potential is 80 units, because the bottleneck capacity is only 50 units, then the performance of the entire pipeline is 50 units. So the fact that it has the potential to operate at 80 units is irrelevant because it's restricted only by what the capacity of the bottleneck is. Now, similarly, just to sort of accentuate the point here, let's say you have another pipeline that has a capacity of 70 units. At its max potential, its throughput potential is 70 units. And let's say its bottleneck capacity is 60 units. Well, that means the throughput performance is 60 units. So the fact that this second pipeline has less throughput potential is irrelevant. Even though it has less potential, it has a higher performance because the capacity of the bottleneck is higher. This concept is a really important, big concept.